Emily had always considered her family's small apartment a place of comfort, even if it wasn't perfect. The modest two-bedroom space was nestled in a quiet suburb where she had grown up, surrounded by familiar faces, and the same tree-lined streets she had walked as a child. The apartment wasn't extravagant, but it was rich in memories. The kitchen walls bore faint marks of Emily's height as a child, lovingly measured by her late grandfather. The living room still held the worn-out couch where she and her father would watch old movies every Sunday. It wasn't just an apartment. It was home. But over the years, Emily had started to notice cracks in her parents' relationship that no amount of paint or patchwork could cover. Her father, James, was a quiet, hard-working man who spent most of his time trying to make ends meet, while her mother, Susan, seemed increasingly dissatisfied. Susan had always been ambitious, the kind of woman who cared about appearances and material success. She often talked about how she'd dreamed of a bigger house, better furniture, and the kind of lifestyle she felt she deserved. Her frustration often spilled over into arguments, which Emily would overhear from her room. One evening, everything changed. Emily had come home late from work, tired and hoping for a quiet dinner. As she stepped into the dimly lit apartment, she noticed her mother in the kitchen, speaking in a hushed but urgent tone on the phone. Emily paused, her hand on the doorknob, as Susan's words drifted into the hallway. "I've already filed the preliminary paperwork," Susan said, her voice sharp and clipped. "Once the divorce is finalized, the apartment will be mine. James won't fight it. He never does. He's too spineless to stand up for himself." Emily froze, her mind racing. Divorce? Her parents had their disagreements, but she never imagined it had reached this point. Worse still, her mother sounded cold and calculating, as if this wasn't about irreconcilable differences but something far more sinister. But what about Emily? The voice on the other end of the call asked. It was muffled, but Emily could tell it was a woman, perhaps one of her mother's friends. "She'll have to deal with it," Susan replied dismissively. "This apartment is legally in my name. I made sure of that years ago. James doesn't have a claim, and if Emily sides with him, that's her mistake. I'm done compromising." Emily's heart sank. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The apartment wasn't just in Susan's name. It had been gifted to both her parents by her grandfather, who had always emphasized the importance of family unity. Emily's grandfather had been a kind, practical man who valued fairness above all else. Before he passed away, he had made it clear that the apartment was for both James and Susan, a shared home that symbolized their partnership. Emily's stomach churned with a mix of anger and disbelief. Her mother had always been strong-willed, but this was something else entirely. How long had she been planning this? And how could she lie so easily about the apartment's ownership? As Susan ended the call and began cleaning up the kitchen, Emily quietly retreated to her room, her mind spinning. She couldn't let this happen. Not only was it unfair to her father, but it also felt like a betrayal of everything her grandfather had stood for. Emily needed to know the full story. The next day, Emily decided to dig deeper. She started with her grandfather's old documents, which she had kept in a small box in her closet. Flipping through faded papers and handwritten notes, she finally found what she was looking for: the original deed to the apartment. Her grandfather's name was on it, followed by both James and Susan as joint owners. Her hands trembled as she read the document. This was proof that her mother had lied. But why? What was Susan planning to do with the apartment once it was hers? Emily's thoughts turned to the arguments she had overheard over the years. Her mother complaining about their modest lifestyle, hinting at wanting a better future. Maybe Susan planned to sell the apartment and use the money to start over, leaving James with nothing. Emily decided she needed more information before confronting her mother. She spent the next few days quietly observing, paying closer attention to her parents' interactions. James seemed oblivious to what was happening. He went about his routine as usual, fixing small things around the apartment and asking Emily about her day. Susan, on the other hand, was more distant than ever. She avoided conversation with James, barely acknowledging him at dinner. One evening, as James was watching TV in the living room, Emily noticed her mother sitting at the dining table, poring over a stack of papers. Emily casually walked by, pretending to grab a glass of water, and caught a glimpse of the documents. They looked like legal papers, likely related to the divorce. Emily couldn't hold back any longer. "Mom, can we talk?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. Susan looked up, startled. "What is it, Emily?" "I'm busy." "I overheard your phone call the other night," Emily said, cutting straight to the point. "You're planning to divorce Dad and take the apartment. Why would you do that?" Susan's expression hardened. "That's none of your business," she snapped. "This is between me and your father." "It is my business," Emily shot back. "This apartment was meant for both of you. Grandpa made that clear. You can't just take it for yourself." Susan sighed, her tone turning icy. "Your grandfather's intentions don't matter. Legally, this apartment is mine. I made sure of that years ago." Emily's heart sank further. She had suspected as much, but hearing her mother admit it so casually felt like a punch to the gut. "So you forged documents?" Emily asked, her voice trembling with anger. Susan's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone, young lady. You don't know what you're talking about." Emily took a deep breath, struggling to keep her composure. "I know enough, and I'm not going to let you get away with this." Susan's lips curled into a bitter smile. "And what are you going to do about it, Emily? Take me to court? Side with your father, who can't even stand up for himself? Good luck." Emily didn't respond. She turned and walked back to her room, her mind racing. Susan was right about one thing. James wasn't likely to fight back. But Emily wasn't about to let her mother's greed tear their family apart. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. As she sat on her bed, staring at the deed in her hands, Emily made a silent vow. Her mother might think she had everything under control, but Emily wasn't going to back down. If Susan wanted a battle, Emily was ready to fight. The following morning, Emily woke up with a renewed sense of determination. Her mother's betrayal still weighed heavily on her mind, but she knew that anger alone wouldn't solve anything. She needed to stay calm and focused, to uncover everything Susan had done and figure out how to stop her. The key to everything lay in the past, in the documents her grandfather had left behind, and the memories that might hold hidden clues. Emily decided to start with her grandfather's belongings. After his death 5 years ago, many of his possessions had been packed away and stored in the attic. Emily climbed the creaky ladder, flashlight in hand, and opened the door to the dusty, forgotten space. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, cardboard boxes, and items that hadn't been touched in years. Emily's eyes scanned the piles until she found a large wooden chest that had belonged to her grandfather. Kneeling down, she opened the chest carefully. Inside, she found an assortment of personal items, photographs, letters, and small trinkets from his travels. Among them was a thick envelope marked Deeds and Legal Documents. Emily's heart raced as she pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a collection of papers, including the original deed to the apartment. She studied it carefully, noting the names of her father and mother listed as joint owners. This confirmed what she had already found in her own records, but there was something else, a handwritten note attached to the deed. It was a letter from her grandfather, addressed to both James and Susan. The note read, "To James and Susan, this apartment is my gift to you both, a home where you can build a life together. It is my hope that this place will always remain a symbol of your partnership and a legacy for Emily. Remember, family is the most important thing we have. Treat each other with love and fairness." Emily felt a lump in her throat as she read the words. Her grandfather had been a man of deep principles, and the note was a testament to his belief in family unity. How could her mother betray that? How could she so easily dismiss his wishes? As she placed the note back into the envelope, Emily noticed another document tucked at the bottom of the pile. It was a bank statement from years ago, showing that James had contributed half of the funds for the apartment's purchase. This was the evidence she needed to prove. But something didn't add up. If the deed clearly stated joint ownership, and there was proof of her father's financial contributions, how could Susan claim sole ownership? Emily suspected that her mother must have altered the paperwork at some point, but she needed more proof to figure out how and when it happened. Over the next few days, Emily dedicated every spare moment to her investigation. She visited the local property records office, where she requested copies of any documents related to the apartment. The clerk handed her a file, and as Emily flipped through it, her suspicions were confirmed. One of the documents, a transfer of ownership form, was dated 3 years ago. It stated that James had willingly signed over his share of the apartment to Susan, making her the sole owner. Emily knew this couldn't be true. Her father would never have agreed to something like that, especially without telling her. The signature at the bottom of the form looked like James's, but Emily's gut told her it was a forgery. She remembered her mother's dismissive tone, her casual admission that she had made sure the apartment was legally hers. This must have been what Susan meant. She had forged the document to cut James out, securing sole ownership for herself. Emily felt a surge of anger, but she knew she couldn't act on it yet. She needed solid evidence to expose the forgery. After some research, she learned that forensic handwriting analysis could determine whether the signature was genuine. Emily decided to take the document to a handwriting expert, but she knew it would take time and money to get the results. In the meantime, she continued digging into her parents' financial history. She found old bank statements and receipts that showed her father had made regular payments for the apartment's maintenance and repairs over the years. This was further proof of his investment in the property. As Emily pieced together the puzzle, she began to see the full scope of her mother's deception. Susan had spent years planning this, slowly positioning herself to take control of the apartment. She had used James's trusting nature against him, manipulating him into signing papers without fully understanding their implications. Emily's heart ached for her father. He had always been a kind and gentle man, devoted to his family. He didn't deserve this betrayal. She thought back to all the times she had seen him working late nights or fixing things around the apartment, quietly ensuring that their home was a safe and comfortable place. But Emily also knew that confronting her mother wouldn't be easy. Susan was cunning and ruthless, and she wouldn't back down without a fight. Emily decided to focus on building an airtight case before taking any action. She reached out to a lawyer, explaining the situation and sharing the evidence she had gathered so far. The lawyer, a compassionate woman named Rachel, listened carefully and offered valuable advice. She confirmed that the forged signature could be challenged in court, but it would require strong evidence and witness testimony. Rachel also suggested that Emily speak to her father, as his cooperation would be crucial in any legal proceedings. Emily hesitated. She knew her father would be devastated by the truth, and she hated the thought of putting him through more pain. But she also knew that staying silent would only allow her mother to continue her schemes. That evening, Emily sat down with her father in the living room. The TV was on, but James muted it when he saw the serious expression on her face. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important," Emily began, her voice steady but gentle. James looked concerned. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emily took a deep breath. "It's about Mom. She's planning to divorce you, and she's trying to take the apartment for herself." James's face fell, and for a moment he looked like a man who had just been struck by a heavy blow. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily explained everything. What she had overheard, the forged documents, and the evidence she had found. She showed him the deed, the bank statements, and the transfer of ownership form. James sat in stunned silence, his hands trembling as he held the papers. "I can't believe she would do this," he said finally, his voice filled with disbelief and hurt. "I'm so sorry, Dad," Emily said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But we can fight this. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and she thinks we have a strong case." James looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and sadness. "Thank you, Emily. I don't know what I'd do without you." As they sat together in the quiet apartment, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to protect her father and honor her grandfather's legacy. Her mother's betrayal had shaken their family to its core, but Emily was ready to fight for the truth. The weeks that followed Emily's conversation with her father were a whirlwind of tension, planning, and sleepless nights. James, though heartbroken, agreed to stand up to Susan and fight for what was right. For Emily, it was a bittersweet relief to see her father show some resolve after years of being overshadowed by her mother's domineering personality. Yet the looming divorce proceedings felt like a storm brewing on the horizon, inevitable and destructive. One crisp Tuesday morning, Emily's fears became reality. A neatly folded envelope landed on their doorstep, its contents cold and formal. Divorce papers. Susan had made her move. The papers outlined her demand for sole ownership of the apartment, citing the transfer of ownership form as evidence that James had no legal claim to the property. The document painted a picture of an irreparable marriage, with Susan positioning herself as the sole contributor to the family's well-being. James sat at the kitchen table, the papers spread out before him, his hands trembling as he read through each page. Emily sat beside him, her jaw clenched in anger. "This is unbelievable," she said, her voice sharp. "She's acting like she's the victim here." James sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "I don't even recognize her anymore. How could she twist things like this?" Emily placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We're going to fight this, Dad. She doesn't get to rewrite history just because it suits her." The first step was responding to the divorce petition. With Rachel's help, James filed a counterclaim, asserting his right to half the apartment and challenging the legitimacy of the transfer of ownership form. Rachel emphasized the importance of proving the forgery, as it was the cornerstone of Susan's case. While the legal battle began to unfold, tensions at home reached a boiling point. Susan, who had temporarily moved in with a friend, began making frequent visits to the apartment, often unannounced. Each visit felt like a calculated attempt to assert dominance. She would sweep through the rooms, inspecting every corner as if preparing to claim it as her own. One afternoon, as Emily was working on her laptop in the living room, Susan walked in without so much as a knock. Emily looked up, startled. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "I came to pick up a few things," Susan said curtly, heading straight for the bedroom she used to share with James. Emily followed her, her frustration mounting. "You can't just barge in here whenever you feel like it. This isn't just your apartment." Susan turned to face her, her expression cold. "Actually, it is my apartment, Emily. You and your father are just guests at this point." Emily felt her anger rise, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We both know that's not true. You're trying to take something that doesn't belong to you, and we're not going to let you get away with it." Susan smirked. "Good luck proving that in court. By the time this is over, you'll see that I always get what I want." After Susan left, Emily immediately called Rachel to update her on the situation. Rachel reassured her that Susan's overconfidence could work against her. "The more she acts like she's already won, the more likely she is to slip up and reveal something useful," Rachel said. "Keep documenting everything, conversations, visits, anything that might help build your case." Meanwhile, Emily continued working on the forgery angle. She sent the questionable document to a handwriting expert, who agreed to analyze the signature and compare it to verified samples of James's handwriting. The process was painstakingly slow, and every day of waiting felt like an eternity. In the midst of the chaos, Emily discovered another piece of the puzzle. While searching through an old filing cabinet, she found a set of emails between Susan and a real estate agent. The messages were dated from 2 years ago, shortly after the alleged transfer of ownership, and discussed the possibility of selling the apartment. Susan had even gone so far as to request an appraisal of the property's value. Emily felt a surge of triumph as she read through the emails. This was concrete evidence that Susan had been planning to sell the apartment long before filing for divorce. It proved that her motives weren't about preserving a home for the family, but rather about personal gain. When Emily shared the emails with Rachel, the lawyer's eyes lit up. "This is exactly the kind of evidence we need to challenge her credibility," Rachel said. "If we can show the court that she's been scheming to sell the apartment for years, it will undermine her entire case." As the court date approached, the tension between Susan and James grew unbearable. Susan's lawyer had requested a mediation session in an attempt to settle the dispute without a full trial. Emily and James reluctantly agreed, knowing it was a chance to present their evidence and gauge Susan's reaction. The mediation session was held in a sterile conference room at the courthouse. Susan sat on one side of the table, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. James and Emily sat opposite her, with Rachel by their side. The mediator, a calm and professional woman in her 40s, began by outlining the purpose of the session: to find a mutually agreeable resolution. Susan's lawyer started by reiterating her claim to the apartment, citing the transfer of ownership form as proof. "Miss Collins has been the sole owner of the property for 3 years, he said confidently. "Mr. Collins voluntarily relinquished his share, and we see no reason to dispute this arrangement." Rachel leaned forward, her tone measured but firm. "We do have reason to dispute it. The transfer of ownership form is fraudulent, and we intend to prove that in court, if necessary." The mediator raised an eyebrow. "Fraudulent? That's a serious accusation." Rachel nodded. "It is, and we have evidence to support it. We've submitted the document for handwriting analysis, and we're confident the results will confirm that Mr. Collins' signature was forged." Susan's expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly composed herself. "That's ridiculous," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "James signed that form willingly. He just doesn't want to admit it now because he's bitter about the divorce." Emily couldn't stay silent any longer. "If that's true, then why were you talking to a real estate agent about selling the apartment 2 years ago, before you even filed for divorce?" The room fell silent. Susan's lawyer glanced at her, clearly caught off guard. Susan's face turned pale, and for the first time she seemed genuinely unsettled. Rachel seized the moment. "We have copies of those emails, which clearly show Miss Collins' intent to sell the property without Mr. Collins's knowledge. This isn't about fairness or preserving a family home." The mediator looked at Susan, her expression serious. "Miss Collins, is there any truth to these allegations?" Susan opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it, her jaw tightening. She seemed to realize that anything she said could be used against her. The session ended without a resolution, but Emily felt a glimmer of hope as they left the courthouse. Susan's silence had spoken volumes, and Emily knew they were closer than ever to exposing the truth. Back at home, James thanked Emily for her unwavering support. "I don't know how you've stayed so strong through all of this," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Emily smiled softly. "Because this is our home, Dad, and I'm not going to let her take it away from us." Though the battle was far from over, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pieces were finally coming together, and she was determined to see it through to the end. As the court date loomed closer, the pressure weighed heavily on Emily and James. Every day brought new challenges, from Susan's increasing hostility to the endless legal preparations. Despite the strain, Emily felt a growing sense of determination. She had come too far to back down now. The night before the court hearing, Emily sat in her room, going over every piece of evidence they had gathered. The forgery analysis had finally come back, confirming what she had suspected all along. The signature on the transfer of ownership form was not James's. The handwriting expert had provided a detailed report, complete with side-by-side comparisons and technical explanations. It was undeniable proof that Susan had lied. But it wasn't just the forgery that would be their weapon in court. Emily and Rachel had built a solid case, one that painted a damning picture of Susan's deception. The emails about the attempted sale of the apartment, the financial records showing James's contributions, and even Susan's erratic behavior during mediation. All of it added up to a narrative that couldn't be ignored. The next morning, Emily and James arrived at the courthouse early, their nerves palpable. The courtroom was a stark, formal space, its walls lined with shelves of legal volumes. Susan was already there, sitting with her lawyer at the opposite table. She looked composed, but Emily could see the tension in her mother's eyes. The judge, a stern but fair-looking woman in her 60s, entered the room and called the case to order. Rachel began with her opening statement, calmly and methodically outlining their argument. "This case is not just about property," Rachel said. "It's about deception and betrayal. We will show that Miss Collins acted in bad faith, using fraudulent means to strip Mr. Collins of his rightful claim to the apartment." Susan's lawyer countered with his own opening statement, insisting that the transfer of ownership was legitimate and that Susan had been the primary caretaker of the property. But as the proceedings unfolded, it became clear that Rachel had the upper hand. The first major blow to Susan's case came when the handwriting expert took the stand. The expert explained the findings in clear, precise terms, leaving no room for doubt. "Based on my analysis, I can confidently state that the signature on the transfer of ownership form does not match the verified samples of Mr. Collins's handwriting," the expert concluded. Susan's lawyer tried to challenge the testimony, suggesting that James might have altered his signature over time, but the expert remained firm. "The discrepancies are not consistent with natural variation," she said. "They are indicative of deliberate." The next piece of evidence was the email correspondence between Susan and the real estate agent. Rachel presented the emails to the court, walking the judge through the timeline. These emails show that Ms. Collins was actively planning to sell the apartment 2 years before filing for divorce, Rachel said. This contradicts her claim that the property was intended as a family home. Susan shifted uncomfortably in her seat as the judge examined the emails. Her lawyer attempted to argue that the correspondence was merely exploratory, but the context made it clear that Susan's intentions were far from innocent. Finally, James took the stand. Emily watched with a mixture of pride and sorrow as her father recounted his side of the story. He spoke about his financial contributions to the apartment, his relationship with Susan, and the shock of discovering the forged document. "I trusted her," James said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I believed we were building a life together, a home for our family. I never imagined she would go behind my back and try to take it all away." When it was Susan's turn to testify, her composure began to crack. Under cross-examination, Rachel pressed her on the forgery and the emails. Susan grew defensive, her answers evasive and contradictory. At one point, Rachel asked, "Miss Collins, if you believed the transfer of ownership was legitimate, why did you feel the need to hide it from your husband and daughter?" Susan hesitated, her gaze flickering to the judge before looking down at her hands. I didn't think they would understand," she said weakly. Rachel seized the moment. "Or was it because you knew they would object, because you knew what you were doing was wrong?" Susan didn't answer, and the silence was deafening. When the time came for closing arguments, Rachel delivered a powerful summation. "This case is about justice," she said. "It's about holding people accountable for their actions and protecting the rights of those who have been wronged. Miss Collins's actions were calculated and deceitful, but today the truth has come to light." The judge took several days to deliberate, and the wait was agonizing. Emily and James tried to carry on with their lives, but the uncertainty hung over them like a dark cloud. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable as the judge read her decision. "In reviewing the evidence, it is clear that the transfer of ownership form was forged," the judge said. "This alone invalidates Miss Collins's claim to sole ownership of the apartment. Furthermore, her actions demonstrate a pattern of dishonesty and bad faith. I am ruling in favor of Mr. Collins, awarding him a 50% share of the property as outlined in the original deed." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. tears springing to her eyes as she squeezed her father's hand. Susan's face was a mask of shock and fury, her lawyer whispering to her urgently. As they left the courthouse, James turned to Emily, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. Emily smiled, though her heart was heavy with the knowledge of how much had been lost. "We did it together, Dad. This is your home, and no one can take that away from you." In the weeks that followed, Susan moved out permanently, leaving behind an empty space that felt both liberating and bittersweet. Emily and James began to rebuild their lives, their bond stronger than ever. The apartment, once a source of conflict, became a symbol of resilience and hope. For Emily, the experience was a painful but necessary reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right. She knew the scars of betrayal would take time to heal, but she also knew that love and truth had prevailed in the end. And that, she realized, was the legacy her grandfather would have wanted them to carry forward.